Okay, yeah, that works. So then I would say let's get started. Um, yeah, welcome everyone. It's my great pleasure to have Christopher Wood today for our research seminar. So Chris is the research lead at Cloudflare, and he's also very involved in the TLS and MASC working groups at the IETF. And at Cloudflare, he's focused on security and privacy enhancement to various systems, protocols, and applications. And today, Christopher will talk about privacy-preserving measurements. So welcome, Christopher, and yeah, the floor is yours.
Cool, thank you. Thank you for having me. Thank you everyone for tuning in. I know it's kind of late in the day for most of you people there, or at least from my perspective, it would be late in the day. So appreciate you joining nonetheless. As Philip was saying, so today I'm going to talk about privacy-preserving measurement, a topic that in recent years has grown tremendously in popularity and interest, both in practice and industry, but also in the standardization community. And I'm going to talk a little bit about how we got to where we are today and where we're kind of going. What are some open problems in the space, and how you all might help us further advance this technology forward. So before digging into it, I want to talk a little bit about measurement and what it means to measure using the application of mental health. So if you'll bear with me for a moment, mental health, as I'm sure like most people are aware of by now, is obviously an important thing. Equally important to physical health and emotional health and whatnot. People who focus on mental health, try to improve it on a number of dimensions. Maybe they try to focus on like their gratitude or their kindness or their awareness. Maybe try to deal with anxiety, stress, or depression. A whole slew of things that are relevant for are relevant to or influence your own personal mental health. And there are today lots of applications that people use for practicing mindfulness and trying to improve their mental health. So here I have some example, this mindfulness.example website where some hypothetical user might interact with for the purposes of trying to improve their mental health. And let's say you're the developer of this particular application, and your purpose is to try to add meaningful user value. As a developer, you might ask yourself, what is real user value? It could come in many different forms. So for example, it might come in, or you might be able to assess user value in terms of how many times the user engages with the application in a particular day. Are they using it a lot? Are they using it frequently? How long are their sessions for interacting with it? And then within the app, what particular topics are they focusing on? Are they focusing on perhaps stress or depression related things? Are they focusing on awareness or kindness or gratitude or what have you? As a way of trying to assess what is the most important things to end users. And by measuring these types of things, the idea is that you could, improve the quality of your application and ultimately deliver more value for your end users. So these are important things to measure in practice, and this is not an uncommon scenario for many applications. Not just specific to this one particular use case. So how might you go about measuring this? Well, imagine you had the application produce some measurement report that had some data about how a particular user was interacting with the application. Maybe it measured the number of times the user opened the application, what topics they were looking at, or whatever. And imagine the app sent this report over to some application server, some central application server for computing or some aggregate or looking at data and trying to draw some conclusions from that. This, although the naive and easy way to do it is quite problematic from a user privacy perspective, because this application server in this particular case learns a tremendous amount of information about an individual, and especially information that might be considered sensitive depending on your perspective. So in this particular case, maybe the report has the user's email address because that's how they interact with and store state with the app. Maybe it has like the client's IP address from which the report emanated. And then the content of the report, the actual measurement itself, contains, information that's sensitive to that particular user, like what topics they're looking at, how often they're using these particular topics, and so on. So this isn't great for obvious reasons. And although it would be, easy to implement and it would get the job done, we'd like to do better, especially as an app that's like supposed to, improve and add value to the end user, not like infringe upon their privacy. So you might think maybe I could, maybe I can improve the situation by, uploading these reports in a quote anonymous way. So say, for example, I were to proxy my reports through some generic proxy. Here I've just you introduced the term or this entity called the proxy that sits between the client and this application server that sends encrypted reports back and forth between the client and the application server. And there's a lot of applications of these type of proxy technology, so I'm not assuming any particular one. Maybe you have like a Tor, you connect over Tor and send the report over to the application server that way. Or maybe you use something that's like more application specific, like oblivious HTTP. At the end of the day, it doesn't matter. The basic idea is that you're using some sort of anonymization layer to, remove potentially identifying information from the report. So what you might get on the other end at the application server is, a report that's, perhaps not as unique to a particular individual as it once was. So in this case, maybe it has the IP address of the proxy that sits between the client and the server. But you still have like meaningful application data, still have the same topics. In this particular case, you still have the same frequency information. And depending on, how specific and how how many dimensions there are to this data, that could potentially be not good. I'll touch on that a little bit. So maybe instead of trying to anonymize, maybe you'll actually, you'll look at like potentially changing the content of the report itself. So maybe you'll add some noise to that. So if you're familiar with differential privacy as a concept, maybe you'll add some noise in a local DP-like way, such that the report that's ultimately uploaded to the application server is appropriately not identifying for this individual user. And how you tune your noise and how and whatnot is a separate complicated question that people still don't seem to have a very good answer for. But in theory, something like this is possible, and there have been like schemes proposed for doing this exact thing. So in this particular arrangement, maybe you get something that's unique to the client in terms of like their IP address, but the actual content of the report might be less useful. So you might get like either data that's not exactly what the user would have reported, or data that is noisy or what have you. But at the end of the day, like the utility of the data goes down because you're adding noise to improve the end user's privacy. So this trade-off, depending on how much noise you're adding, may not be useful for the actual measurement that you want to carry out, to see what things are useful for end users to improve them and ultimately improve the end user's experience. So turns out that measurement is challenging in practice. There's a number of complicating factors with the approaches that were previously listed. So for example, obviously like the naive approach of just sending everything to a central server is perhaps not great, especially if that central server is not trusted to be a good custodian of that data. Like what happens if that central server is compromised and the data gets breached, or just the central server is malicious and does bad things with the data. In systems where you have this fundamental trade-off between privacy and utility, it's often difficult to tune that trade-off in a way that's sensible for all users. Like I said, still today we don't really, I think, as a community, understand what is a good value for this differential privacy noise that we want to add. Still, to my knowledge, still kind of an area of active and ongoing research to figure out like what is the appropriate way to tune this stuff. So in general, like those types of approaches, while like in principle are effective, in practice are difficult to do well. And And then the anonymized approach, where you sort of like strip out potentially identifying information, but leave in original or not noisy content, still can potentially be de-anonymized. In fact, like back in 2008, I think it was, some Netflix data that was supposedly anonymized was spectacularly de-anonymized due to the high dimensionality of the data. Sweeney has this, famous quote back in 2014 that, or a famous finding rather, that a huge proportion of people can be identified in a unique way based on some, very simple set of information. So, even though you think you may have like filtered out, what is, potentially sensitive for the purposes of a given report, it's more likely than not that you've not done a sufficient job. So this begs the question, how do we actually measure this stuff in a privacy-preserving way? What is the actual problem that we're trying to solve here? And so informally, I claim that if we were to go about and measure this stuff in a privacy-preserving way, we might seek to do so in a way that satisfies these three conditions here. The first of which is that the measurement that you're collecting reveals the minimum amount of information, where the minimum in this particular case is the aggregate. It's the function that you want to compute over the data. So maybe it's the total number of times a user happens to open an app, or the total number of times, the average number of times that all users happen to open an app, as an example. You might also want to be able to specifically quantify any leakage that's revealed or exposed beyond that minimal amount of information. So you can, perhaps reason about, if I were to measure something in this particular way, what is the risk? What is the inherent risk that I take on by collecting this data and, looking at this aggregate? And then I think just from a practical perspective, you'd like to, collect this data or do these measurements in a way that very trivial attacks, classical trivial attacks like membership inference, data reconstruction, or re-identification attacks are not possible. And these were things that were all sort of driving, for example, the census, U.S. Census application of differential privacy for their use case. So with that as the goal, the aggregate that you might want to compute is very simple. It's just like some arbitrary function f in this particular case over some set of inputs, some xi or x1 to xn in this particular case, and the aggregate is this value y. And so what are the different types of aggregates that you might be interested in? Well, there's a whole whole set of possible useful aggregates. So for example, you might want the total count, you might want the arithmetic mean, you might want like discrete histograms, and you might want what I'll call heavy hitters. Popular elements in a particular set of strings in this particular case. These are all, generally speaking, types of aggregate measurements that one application might want to compute over user data. And so the fundamental question that we seek to ask, or we seek to answer rather, is how do we compute these aggregates in a privacy-preserving way, where privacy-preserving is, as I sort of informally defined it on the previous slide. And that's where sort of Prio kind of came into the mixture. So Prio is a fantastic protocol. It effectively, in my view, kind of solves this problem for a certain class of aggregate measurements. Other classes of aggregate measurements are still work in progress and whatnot. But Prio is fantastic, simple, lightweight, and I'll describe it to you in a handful of slides, and I hope you'll agree at the end that it's also simple. So to describe how it works, start with we'll use a simple example. In this particular case, the count aggregate, or the sum, where you're just computing the sum over some inputs, some xi inputs, n of them. And the obvious naive way to do this is just to look at all the individual values and sum them up. But this would not satisfy our definition of privacy preserving measurement. because I see all the individual values. I learn more than the output aggregate y. So how might I go about computing this in a way that only reveals to me the aggregate output? So what Prio does is it uses secret sharing in a clever way. So for each input xi, it additively secret shares this amongst two non-colluding parties. So generates a random value, use the difference between the measurement and that particular random value, and then the two secret shares are that difference and then the random value. And you can clearly see that if you add these two together, you get the original measurement, hence additive secret sharing. So with this sort of basic concept or basic primitive in place, what Prio does is it basically additively secret shares every single measurement across two non-colluding servers. Each non-colluding server in this particular case locally aggregates their secret shares and then sends their local aggregates to a collector who can then sum the two together and compute the average. And if you were to write this out and do this on paper, it should be fairly clear that the output y in this particular case matches that which is which we wanted to compute in the original case, because the effectively the random noise just cancels out. So this is very simple, very easy to reason about, and indeed does solve this property wherein each aggregator in this particular case never learns the individual input, because the random noise or the random value that's generated during the secret sharing step like perfectly hides the input measurement, and the only thing that the collector learns is the final aggregate output. So fantastic, like, for all intents and purposes, we solved this problem. However, in the real world, things are not as simple and as clean. We have to deal with potential of clients, malicious clients in particular, misbehaving or trying to mess with the protocol to basically corrupt the output. So imagine you had, for example, and there's a there is a typo on this slide, or several typos on the slide, but imagine you had, for example, this this malicious client who has measurement x2 as its measurement. It sends to one aggregator an appropriate share, and then it sends to another aggregator garbage. So the equation on the bottom should be that r is equal to the sum of r values, ri values, not xi values. So just do a simple substitution, mental substitution, and everything should be okay. So with the exception of R2 in this particular case, all other shares are correct. But if once each aggregator does the local aggregation and then sends them to the collector who then adds things together, the output is garbage. And this is problematic because by virtue of like how the additive secret sharing works, each aggregator has no idea whether or not the thing that it's adding to the local aggregate is correct. Otherwise, it would violate the definition of this thing being a privacy preserving measurement protocol. So that is the dilemma that Prio has a very clever solution for, and it does. The solution is effectively to present each aggregator with a zero knowledge proof of validity. So if you imagine extending the secret sharing scheme that each client runs to produce values in the following way. So in addition to actually producing secret shares of the input measurements, they also present shares of a proof, a zero knowledge proof, that the input measurement satisfies some particular validity circuit C. So slightly changed notation here to simplify things a little bit, brackets around secret shared values. So this step altogether basically produces for each aggregator a secret share of the input measurement and then a share of the proof. And again, this proof is just a proof that the input measurement that is being secret shared corresponds or satisfies some validity circuit, and that validity circuit might be that the value is either a 0 or 1 if you're counting like bits. It might be that the value is within a certain range if you're computing some arithmetic average or something like that. There's a large number of possibilities for a validity circuit, provided they can be encoded in an arithmetic circuit. But that's effectively the gist. And so now that you have this sort of construct, what happens is the local aggregators, now that they have not only just secret shares of the inputs, but secret shares to these proofs, they will effectively run an interactive MPC protocol between the two of them to check to see if the shares of the proofs that they have or the shares of the measurements that they have satisfy the circuit. So for honestly generated inputs, that is where each aggregator has a correctly generated secret share as well as a correctly generated proof, the verification procedure or the interactive protocol that they run should output 1. And for the invalid case, or the case where one of the aggregators has a garbage basically input, the verification protocol should output a 0. And this is nice because it allows aggregators to reject invalid reports, effectively exclude them from the local aggregate, thereby making sure that even if you have a malicious client that's inputting things, garbage things, it doesn't modify, it doesn't tamper with the output aggregate. So this is Prio in a nutshell. The details of how these groups are generated and how they're verified, I would refer you to the paper for that, or actually better yet, the emergent standard that's sort of evolving around this. But at a high functional level, this is how it works. So clients generate their inputs, running the secret sharing protocol. Local aggregators then will run an MPC protocol between each other to reject invalid reports. And for the valid reports, they'll aggregate them. And then eventually all the aggregates will be sent to a collector for computing the final aggregate. And that's effectively it. So from a security perspective, Prio sort of demands a couple of things. First of all, it demands that the measurement or the protocol itself satisfies a notion of completeness. So, for example, if all of the aggregators are honest and all the clients are honest, that an honestly generated input X will be accepted by everyone. So you want the protocol to actually compute the desired aggregate if everyone behaves accordingly. That one's fairly straightforward. It also demands a notion of robustness, which means that if all the aggregators are honest, they will reject invalid reports. All of them have to be honest, though, in order for this property to hold, which is different from the privacy requirement, where the privacy requirement means that as long as one server is honest, the only thing that anyone ever learns is the output of the validity circuit and nothing more. They don't ever learn any information about the original input measurement. This difference in trust model for these two different properties actually turned out to be kind of a challenge in looking at the analysis of this, and I'll talk about that in a little bit later and refer you to a paper that has some more work on this. But at the end of the day, Prio effectively satisfies these three things, and under very reasonable real-world assumptions, wherein you have two non-colluding servers, at least one of whom is trusted and honest, it allows you to do these measurements in a privacy-preserving way, and in a very efficient way. Because I've described this verification that takes place between the aggregators as an interactive MPC protocol, but in practice, it's just one round. It's just one round of communication between one aggregator and the other, and very efficient and compared to potentially other privacy-preserving measurement MPC-like techniques. Which is why I made the kind of claim at the outset that this effectively, Prio is kind of like the ideal solution to this problem in many cases. Okay, so Prio is fantastic. It's seen deployment already at a very massive scale. So, for example, if you're not aware, the exposure notification analytics system that Apple and Google put together for, or in the emergence of COVID, is driven in part by Prio underneath the hood. It's Prio plus some composition of local differential privacy to ensure that the data that they're getting out the other end really does not satisfy, or really does not violate any end user's privacy. And using that as sort of like demonstration that this technology can scale, it can solve real world problems. We moved it over into the standardization community to hopefully evangelize it and bring it to more use cases. And what that looked like first was trying to generalize the multi-party computation protocol that Prio effectively implements. So if you imagine the sort of sequence diagram that I had earlier on the screen, and you flip it on its side, there's the very natural flow of data through the system from input clients to aggregators to the collector. So you have measurements at the top. They're run through some clients to produce these input shares that go to aggregators. Aggregators run some protocol in between them, and then they produce some output that goes to the collector. What I didn't note, because Prio does not require it, is that there's potentially an iterative process between the collector and aggregators here, depending on the type of MPC that's being done, wherein the collector will basically ask the aggregators, please aggregate this set of batches for me, and I'll specify an aggregation parameter in doing so. And it's probably a bit too much detail to get into right now, but all is to say that whereas the original Prio description was very linear, the actual standard that's emerging has this the possibility for incremental data collection, which is useful for heavy hitter like applications. Anyways, so we wanted to generalize the MPC, and what someone much smarter than myself came up with was this abstraction called a Verifiable distributed aggregation function, or VDAF for short. And it effectively takes all of these steps and produces a very simple syntax and state machine for how this type of MPC works, including like how you shard inputs into, or secret share inputs, how you verify them, how you aggregate them, and then eventually how you produce the final aggregate output. So VDAF is a specification currently being developed in the CFRG. And in that specification, there are a number of specific type of or instantiations of VDAFs, as they're called, that are specified for the different types of measurements that I alluded to earlier. So one of which is count, one of which is summation, histogram, and then there's one for heavy hitters as well, which is the reason why you have this incremental or iterative sort of collection process. The arithmetic ones are sort of based on Prio, because Prio is highly efficient and very easy to run at scale. The heavy hitters one is based on Poplar, also work from sort of the same people, but it's a different sort of, the internal details are a little bit different. So I refer you again to the specification for that, but we can talk about it later. And the difference between each of these is, not only like what particular type of measurement or aggregate are they computing, but also, how the inputs are encoded and what validity means for each of these particular things. So the count construction, for example, just counts 0 or 1 events. And so the validity circuit is like checking to see that each input measurement, when encoded, is a 0 or a 1. Whereas the sum is like an arithmetic sum, so sum over some set of integers, and the validity circuit is the integer within like a reasonable range, and so on. So VDAF, it's really kind of minimal. It requires only a couple things to be kind of run in practice, or it requires like sort of minimal configuration. So, for example, all the different parties involved, so the clients, aggregators, and the collector, all have to agree on the measurement type, which is perhaps obvious. You have to agree on the algorithm that you're running in order to compute this thing. Aggregators have to additionally agree on some sort of shared randomness that's used in the MPC protocol for the purposes of verifying proofs. And the collector has to just basically be configured with a type of query that it wants to run. Where a type of query might be, basically determining what types of batch or what batch of reports I want to compute an aggregate over. All of this, though, is really insufficient for actually like shipping something and doing something in the real world. There are so many questions left unanswered if you want to actually take this like basic constructor, and I shouldn't use the word basic because it's really quite complicated stuff. If you want to take this, this primitive and actually, put it into software. So for example, how do you transport reports? Like what protocol you're actually using? How do you distribute key material between the different aggregators and between clients and aggregators? How do you determine what goes into a batch and what doesn't go into a batch? How do you deal with all the state that you have to maintain? And how do you associate reports with a given measurement job and all sorts of things? So perhaps unsurprisingly, there is another protocol to deal with this that just layers quite nicely on top of VDAF that we have coined or called the Distributed Aggregation Protocol. And this is the thing that effectively drives VDAF. It is kind of uninteresting in all other respects. It just is a simple way to kind of move the VDAF state machine forward and provide the right inputs and provide the right configuration parameters. So for example, it specifies things like use of HTTP to exchange messages between clients and aggregators. It uses public key encryption to make sure that input shares or these additively secret shared input shares are encrypted under the respective aggregators, such that both aggregators don't see the secret shares and just like trivially combine them to reveal the result. It also has a bunch of other mechanics and accommodations in place to basically allow someone to use this thing in practice, to like write software to actually like drive Prio. And it's quite nice, I think, in that it's logically separated into three separate phases or sub protocols, if you will. There's an upload phase, an aggregate phase, and then a collect phase. And it maps kind of cleanly to the underlying VDAF construction if you imagine it sort of behind the scenes in this way. So the upload phase of the protocol is when clients they run the VDAF step for generating their input shares, and then DAP in the upload phase, it asks clients to encrypt them for each aggregator and then upload them to a leader, which is a sort of blessed or trusted aggregator that manages basically the aggregation job that's going to take place. And this encryption step is important because if you're sending both your input shares to the same party, you want to make sure that that same party can't obviously just trivially combine things. Then there's the aggregation phase, wherein the leader and what we call the helper, which is like this, other non-colluding aggregator, engage in this MPC protocol to compute their local aggregate shares. And then the collector is effectively the one that asks the leader, say, hey, give me the aggregate output shares for, this batch of time or this chunk of time, or give me the aggregate output shares for the last n reports of this fixed size or whatever. And so if you can imagine, using this, or if you imagine mapping this to the real world, clients will live on your devices. They will be in your browsers or in your operating system or in your apps, wherever. The leader and the helper will be kind of services that you interact with that you choose to trust or not trust. And then a collector will be basically, kind of a customer of these aggregators. Like I'm, as a collector of potential data, I'm asking this MPC service to basically help me privately collect this data, or measure this data, I should say. Collector is perhaps not the right term because it kind of maybe implies that you're collecting all the individual data, but really all you're doing is getting the aggregate output. So note to self to potentially, revisit that, but that's the basic idea, and that's how it basically maps onto, real world systems. And similar to VDAF, it's configured, in a kind of similar way, except that for obvious reasons, there's a lot more stuff to configure. First of all, you need to, if you want to actually run DAP in practice, you need to agree on like a sort of what we call measurement job or task that you want to run, and there's like a particular ID associated with it, so that when you send a report, it's associated with that task, and it will be included in aggregates for that particular task, so you don't have like just everyone throwing data into the same bucket. You have to agree on sort of the VDAF type, so the construction underneath the hood. What is the type of aggregate that you want to compute? As a client, you might also want to agree on, what type of differential privacy parameters you want to add if you're like applying local differential privacy. And I'm realizing now that the collector should also get those parameters so it can appropriately remove noise. And then the collectors get a bunch more information, like what is the key material that's necessary for verifying joint randomness between the two? What is the the public key under which these aggregate shares should be encrypted to, and so on and so forth. But at the end of the day, I wish I was sophisticated enough to be able to draw this layering of DAP and VDAF together. But if you imagine again, VDAF sort of sitting right underneath DAP, DAP is just basically poking into these well-defined interfaces for DDAF, passing in inputs, getting outputs, putting them in HTTP messages, and sending them over the wire. And then there's a database involved somewhere to store some intermediate state, and some public keys involved to encrypt state as it moves across different non-trusting or non-including parties. And that's kind of it. The specification is obviously quite complex. I'm simplifying a lot and hand-waving a lot for the purposes of like enticing you to read it. But this is functionally sort of how the system works. All right, so talked about how we might want to measure, what we might want to measure, how Prio sort of works, how Prio was taken from this paper, turned into like a real specification that you can implement and ship, and deploy in all sorts of applications. And where do we go from here now that we have the kind of specifications being actively worked on and developed? You might ask, like, okay, what more is there to be done if you just told us that this problem's super simple and solved? Well, in fact, there's a lot of more work to be done, and I'm hopeful people here in this room are interested enough to to talk to us about it and perhaps get involved. So as a matter of procedure, there's the standardization effort is still ongoing. If you're unfamiliar with the IETF, things take quite a while, but DAP has been through a number of different drafts. It's currently sitting at draft 5 according to this timeline, and there are already several different implementations that exist. One called Daphne, one called Janus or Janus, I think it's Janus, and then a shared VDAP implementation under the hood that's currently called libprio, but I expect it to be called renamed to like libVDAP or something in the future, because it's being generalized to align on that specification. We're doing experiments with this stuff in the real world right now. So Firefox is working with DivvyUp, a sort of child of ISRG, the same company that did Let's Encrypt, and Cloudflare for the purposes of each of those two parties running non-including aggregators to test this standard out to see if it performs as well as we expect. What are the sharp edges of either DAP or of VDAP and using this thing? So stay tuned and we'll hear more about this later. There's been some preliminary analysis on VDAP. This is a thing I was alluding to earlier. There is a paper up on ePrint. You can find it. What I think might be most interesting to people is the way in which the people here chose to go about analyzing VDAP. Whereas typically most MPC things are analyzed and formalized in the UC framework. This paper chose to use games for very reasonable or very pragmatic reasons. In particular, because of these two different properties I was talking about earlier. There's a robustness and privacy property, wherein you might want to have different bounds for each of them. And that turns out to be kind of difficult to do when you model everything in the UC framework. So they found that like using games allowed them to, have much tighter bounds for each of these two and reason about them independently. That is not to say that, UC analysis of this tech work would not be welcomed. It's like, this is just the technique that these experts chose to use for their particular work. So if there are any UC people in the room who, are interested in this line of work, I highly encourage you to talk with them and potentially dig in. But that's just VDAF. There's a lot of like potential other problems things that could go wrong at the layer above at DAP. And DAP, as any sort of IETF protocol and standard, still requires formal analysis before it goes out the door. And so the obvious questions are, does DAP satisfy the requirements for VDAF? Because VDAF has certain requirements for how it's configured, how it's used, how it's driven. And while intuitively we think that, yes, we've constructed DAP in such a way that it satisfies those requirements, it sure would be a lot better if we had proof that it did so. So what that looks like is, perhaps, an interesting question to explore. Maybe it's a, symbolic model of DAP in something like Tamarin or ProVerif, or maybe a different type of proof methodology. But at the end of the day, we want to know if DAP, when, plugged together with VDAF, really, achieves the goals that it sets out to in terms of correctness, or completeness, rather, robustness, and privacy. The next big item, in addition, or after we sort of like, kind of ship DAP and VDAF, is I guess a better understanding of how we compose differential privacy with this protocol. Because as I was alluding to earlier, existing deployments of this, especially in EMPA, use differential privacy amplified with shuffling to sort of get it closer to the central differential privacy results and utility. But right now we're sort of we're trying not to bite off more than we can chew in the IETF, and we've not really spent much time thinking about, okay, how might we guide applications that are consuming or using DAP to apply local differential privacy? Or conversely, how might we modify VDAF to accommodate central differential privacy? These are sort of kind of unanswered questions that would be helpful because MPC and differential privacy naturally compose well with one another. And it's especially important when you start to consider like Sybil-like attacks on DAP, which you may have been thinking about as I was describing Prio earlier, that I didn't cover. And differential privacy kind of helps in those particular cases. But it also might help, enable more functionality that's currently not supported. So one thing that DAP sort of is quite rigid about right now is how it computes aggregates over certain batches. And in particular, it basically only lets a given report go into one batch, because we're really not sure of like how or what type of intersection attacks might occur if we lifted that restriction. But if we had differential privacy, we might be able to loosen that restriction and allow more sort of exploratory like usage of the data. So say, for example, you were computing the average of something of some data set over users in the United States, and then you found like an interesting result and you wanted to drill into a little bit. Maybe you would want to refine your aggregate to maybe computing the average in a particular state or smaller region or whatnot over the same data, mind you. This currently would not be possible with the restrictions that are in place. Perhaps with differential privacy, it would be. Beyond sort of trying to figure out how these two compose together, whether or not they are composable based on like the interfaces that VDAF and DAP expose, we also potentially want to help people use it well. So I really try to describe DAP in a way here that was intuitive at a high level, but MPC as a concept is already kind of a complicated thing, especially for people who are kind of most familiar with TLS or like two-party protocols. And if it's complicated to communicate this type of technology to engineers, just imagine, how you would reason about this for users. And users could be anyone, could be people who are potentially submitting data into the system that would use DAP for privacy preserving measurement. It could be, people who are actively trying to, consume data from DAP that has been privately measured. Explaining these concepts to them in such that they can, kind of make good choices about, should I use this system? And if I'm going to use this system, how do I choose the appropriate parameters that make sense for my application? So one of the things that DAP allows you to configure, which I mentioned earlier, was the batch size. How many reports do you require to go into a particular aggregate before you output the result? As a naive example, a batch size of 1 is not very helpful from a privacy perspective. But what is the minimum batch size that makes sense for your application? And how does that affect, sort of the usability of the system in practice? Because, as another hypothetical, you might conclude that, oh yeah, using a batch size of, size 1 is obviously not great because I just learn every single individual value. So I'll just make it, maxint, whatever maxint happens to be. But you might never ever recover or, have that many reports to aggregate together. So you might never get any output from the system. So there's a spectrum along which, you can potentially get meaningful data out of the system, and where you place the batch size on that spectrum influences the overall privacy posture of the system. And that is a very difficult question to answer, where you draw the line. And it pertains to also, how you choose differential privacy parameters, what are sensible values for epsilon that you would use if you're also composing this with differential privacy. And there's been some work in this space, specifically for differential privacy. People have tried to do user studies to understand how, consumers of these systems reason about the trade-off between privacy and utility. And I think we might need to do similar types of studies for, not only reasoning about the differential privacy noise, but also reasoning about the batch size or whatever other relevant knobs that people might want to configure for DAP. And that is something we're actively exploring right now, building a kind of similar tool to this. So if you're interested, I'd love to talk about it. Okay, and then the last big problem is, how do we carry forward the experience, the expertise that we built up in, specifying Prio, implementing it, and other VDAFs, and these generally lightweight forms of multi-party computation protocols, and extend it to more complicated stuff. So, for example, there is in the privacy preserving or private advertising technology community group in the W3C, there's this proposal called interoperable private attribution. And it's basically a way to privately measure last clicks, impressions. That may seem like a very simple problem on surface, but the MPC that takes place is quite complicated and a lot more expensive than Prio and similar things. And the gap between something like that in Prio is quite big. And so I guess the question in my mind is how do we close that gap such that it's easier to deploy more complicated MPC systems? What kind of software do we need to enable that? What type of MPC libraries would make designing protocols like this and then actually experimenting with them a lot easier? Because I'm definitely not an MPC expert. I don't pretend to be, but I've seen enough MPC papers to know that there's a tremendous amount of variety and complexity out there. And I don't know what percentage of them have been actually implemented, but I would say it's probably not all of them. And there's probably good reason for that. So basically, how do we bring this stuff closer to practice and using the experience that we're building up here with Prio and VDAF and DAP? Okay. So in the few minutes that remain, I want to wrap up. I just want to re-emphasize that there's a tremendous amount of momentum in this space. There are new VDAFs popping up, like this thing called Plasma. There's Prio Plus. There's other things that you might be able to fit into the VDAF syntax and drive with DAP. But in addition to, like, perhaps trying to analyze VDAF or come up with a new MPC-like system that fits into VDAF, we really need more work on implementations, experiments, usability, basically the stuff that like allows us to transfer this really amazing work into practice. And if you're interested in helping, there are a number of like things you can read, libraries you can look at, mailing list discussions you can check out. I should have mentioned the CFRG mailing list as well, where some of the cryptography is being specified. Or, talk to me, talk to any of the people who are working on these things. They'd be more than happy to, talk with you about, how you could help out, where you can help out, and or just answer any questions you may have. And I think with that, I will take any questions you may have.
Okay, amazing. Thanks a lot, Chris. Let me quickly stop the live stream and the recording, and then we can go over to Q&A.
Sounds good.